Which creepy urban legend turned out to be true? For the last several years in Toronto, gay men have gone missing in the village. The community was convinced it was a serial killer on the loose, but the police said no. These disappearances are unrelated. Turns out that's totally the case, and the guy was killing gay men, dismembering them and burying them in and around the properties he was working at as a groundskeeper/landscaper. The werewolf of Hannover, Germany in the 1920s started as a legend who had some truth to it, but it's definitely creepy though. Teenage boys disappeared, and soon there was a legend about a werewolf who killed them. Turns out it was the serial killer Fritz Harman who bit his 24 young victims over the throat. He first lured them with goods because times were hard after World War I, then after abusing them sexually and killing them by biting, he cut their bodies and sold the meat to the people of Hannover as food, without them knowing what it really was. Fritz was as close to a werewolf a human can get. Sorry for the bad English, not my first language. Black Volga. In the 60s and 70s, there existed an urban legend in Poland, that vampires in black limousines were kidnapping people, preferring little children. It was a tale parents told their kids who would then tell their friends, etc. Turns out it was a rumor that was spread by the Polish secret police who actually used black cars to kidnap people. The aim was that no one would believe someone who would report they had witnessed a kidnapping. Raymond Robinson. The Green Man. Dude lost his eyes and nose and wandered the streets at night in Pennsylvania because he couldn't go outside in the daytime because of how he looked. People saw him and an urban legend in PA was born. I heard he was actually a really nice guy. In Liverpool, kids are taught about Purple Aki from a young age. He's been locally known and feared for honestly 3 decades. He likes feeling boys' muscles and makes them do squats. He's completely real, he's even had court orders against him preventing him from feeling people's muscles. I hope you get raped by Purple Aki. Is a common insult, and a very real fear. Akinwale Arobic is his name. During the court case, DC Andrew Rawlings claimed that Arobic became sexually aroused while forcing terrified young men to perform inverted piggybacks, ordering them to squat so he could lean over their backs with his face by their buttocks and his genitalia on their necks, while squeezing their quad muscles. I went to a university near Valley Forge, PA. It used to be a POW camp and a military hospital before the college bought the entire property for $1 in the 1960s. Since there are really only 3 universities near Valley Forge, PA, it will not be hard to deduce which college it was. Lol. Anyways, there was a rumor that underground tunnels and all sorts of stuff was left abandoned in the abandoned sections of the college. Sure enough, it was true. We found a tunnel hatch under our carpet in our dorm room, 2 hatches on the first floor, furthest most first floor dorm room of each building. It was literally like stepping into 1945. Everything was preserved down there and the tunnels were massive. We eventually ended up in an underground garage where there were 4 Jeeps parked, but all the tires had dry rotted. We realized this was actually beneath our soccer field. Anyways, the tunnels lead to the cafeteria, the admin building, every dorm, and then an old abandoned section of our campus that we had no way of entering topside. We soon realized this was the hospital/morgue. When we got out of the tunnels and walked the floor, it was still like 1945. All the hospital beds were still there, the surgical curtains were still there. Hell, even the tools like the scalpel, saw, pliers, etc. were still on their trays. It was like everyone all of the sudden up and left and nothing had been moved since then. The morgue still had its slabs and sometimes we would dare each other to slide in there for a period of time. But yeah, it was an urban legend on campus until 3 of us decided to risk expulsion to see if it was true. And it was. The North Pond Hermit. Things would go missing in this little vacation community and people attributed it to some mysterious dude. Turned out there was one. He lived out in the woods for 27 years without ever talking to anyone. Out here in Washington there were rumors of a fairy house in the woods somewhere. One park ranger decided to go hunting for it and he actually did find a tree house in the woods. When he looked inside he found a ton of child pornography. He took it down and came back a while later and found it had been put back up. They eventually found who had been using the tree house and arrested him. Cropsy. Sort of like the boogeyman of Staten Island. During the 70s and 80s, kids on the island would go missing and the urban legend would attribute it to Cropsy. As it turned out, there really was a crazy kidnapper and serial killer who was responsible. He was caught and convicted. There is a great documentary about it, used to be on Netflix, not sure if it still is, called Cropsy. Check it out if you get a chance. MKULTRA. The CIA was experimenting with drugs to attempt to mind control people. One of the children was filmed numerous times performing sexual acts with high-ranking federal government officials, in a scheme set up by Cameron and other MKUltra researchers, to blackmail the officials to ensure further funding for the experiments. It's not just that experiment in which the government gave drugs to unsuspecting citizens. Most documents were destroyed, but if this wasn't, just imagine. Edit, since many people asked, it's from In the Name of Science, A History of Secret Programs, Medical Research, and Human Experimentation by Andrew Galisek. In South Carolina, I always heard about Wee Gaskins as a kid, a guy who rode around in a hearse and picked off hitchhikers. A lot of local kids will go to a house rumored to be his looking for ghosts. He was actually a real person. He had 9 confirmed victims, but he claimed over 100 murders. He murdered because he would get an itch to do it, and he liked having complete control over hitchhikers who no one would know were missing. He'd torture, rape, and eventually kill them. My maternal grandmother was kind of a effed up person and associated herself with him, making him breakfast where he sat at the table with her daughters, despite the fact that he had raped and killed a handful of young girls. I don't know if she knew the extent of his murders at that point, but he did tell her that he killed one of his victims by tying her up and shoving a water hose down her throat and turning it on, and she never reported that. This is, thankfully, a somewhat more lighthearted urban legend than a lot of the posted ones so far. So, I'd heard several times from friends and whatnot hearsay tales about this creepy, near mythical, shoe licker, who resided in the Tampa area. Apparently, this dude would walk up to people in public spaces and would ask them about their shoes and ask to see the bottoms of them, and would then drop and do his best to lick the bottoms of the shoes before the person could step back down. Naturally, I thought that was just way too weird, and there was no way this wasn't just people making up some bullcrap story. Then I ran into the guy, at a taco truck. Skinny dude, longish hair, probably homeless from how he was dressed. Could have been 18, could have been 30. Walks up as I'm waiting for what turns out to have been the best taco I've ever had in my existence, a cochinita pibil, for the curious, and asks about the shoes I'm wearing. I'd just finished performing, and was still wearing some Doc Marten boots, and was more than a little soused. He asks if he can see the treads or something like that. I'm all confused and am like, sure, why not, and he drops to the floor, grabs my boot, and starts licking away at the sole. I yelled at the dude, sort of kicked at him, and he scampers off. Weirdest effing interaction ever. When I was young living rural Ontario, we were told as children not to wander too far into the forest, saying that a monster would get us and we wouldn't come home. If anybody knows who Theriot is, that actually turned out to be painfully true. The Anthill Kids cult is absolute insanity. Here you can read about the crimes of Theriot. I'll give you a little taste. However, Theriot's piece de resistance came when one of his followers complained of pain in the abdomen. Theriot forced her to undress, laid her on the kitchen table, punched her in the stomach, performed an enema by shoving a tube up her rectum and filled her up with olive oil. Then he cut her stomach open, ripped out parts of her intestines with his bare hands, and he forced another member to stitch her up. Then, he shoved a tube down her throat and made the other women blow air into it. Unsurprisingly, the woman died the next day. Of course, Theriot as a prophet had the powers of resurrection. This resurrection consisted of drilling a hole in the dead woman's skull and having every male member ejaculate into it. The woman remained dead. Besides these types of operations, Rock had a number of often very sexually violent punishments. Personally, I think the punishment and torture of Gabrielle Lavallee at the hands of Rock is the most sickening, not for the faint of heart. It took the near-death experience of Gabrielle Lavallee to bring to light all these horrible crimes against humanity. Gabrielle had endured blowtorches held to her genitals, 8 of her teeth taken out, and a hypodermic needle breaking off in her spine. She had tried to escape, but could not live without the cult and went back. Rock took this as a good reason to cut off one of her fingers, nail her hand to a table and amputate her entire arm. With a hunting knife. Of course, Gabrielle did not see this as enough reason to actually leave. It took Rock amputating parts of her breasts and smashing her head in with an axe for her to actually flee and contact the authorities. That creepy old guy living down the street was actually the Golden State Killer. This is a very recent and local story as it happened at a middle school that I used to attend. There was this janitor, though he actually left when I was still at the school, and substitute bus driver at our school that everyone loved. He would give all of the kids candy and show them around the areas of the school that kids weren't supposed to go, like the boiler room. I even heard that he ate dinner at a kid's house once. Even after he left the school he would still visit sometimes just to say hi to the kids. There were always some jokes that he was a pedophile, but everyone at the school loved him and thought that he was a great guy. Recently he was arrested for having thousands of pictures and videos of child porn. Makes things pretty weird in hindsight. In my hometown there was a local legend about a man who would sometimes be seen having sex with trees. Some called him Mr. Woodcock, but he was more commonly known as the tree shagger. Though it must be nonsense, but one night a friend and I were out walking his dog along a narrow tree-lined lane. We heard a grunting sound from the undergrowth, and there he was. He was wearing a long overcoat which had wrapped around a poor innocent tree, and he had his trousers around his ankles as he defiled the shrubbery with a flagrant disregard for splinters. The man that worked in a law firm on the 24th story of a building. As a running gag, he would tell everyone that the windows in the building were unbreakable, then proceed to run at one of them full force. Once, he did it and the glass didn't break, but the window popped out of the frame, and he fell to his death 24 stories. I saw this on an urban legend show when I was a kid, but found out later that this really happened in my city, Toronto, Canada. My boyfriend works in the same building, and rumor has it that the man landed on a concrete bench at concourse level. A woman and her child had just been sitting there minutes before his fatal plunge. Yeah, my mom worked in an office adjacent to where he fell to his death. Everyone was sent home early in all of the buildings around it. Apparently, he had been doing this stunt for quite a while with the tour groups, and the problem was that he always used the same window. Each time he did it, he was weakening the window until it just couldn't take it anymore. Freddy Krueger is based on a real story. Hear me out. There's a small ethnic group local to Southeast Asia, the Hmong people. They've been oppressed for years by various countries, so they fought with the US during the Vietnam Civil War. As you know, we lost, and the North Vietnamese were gearing up to kill the Hmong people who had fought for the Southern Vietnamese. So the US airlifted a bunch of Hmong families to the US, primarily in California and Minnesota. One of the recent immigrants was a young man. He was perfectly healthy but suddenly died in his sleep. No one knew how he died. It's guessed it was a heart attack, but an autopsy wasn't done. This sent a panic throughout the community. There is a Hmong legend of a spirit that enters your dreams and kills you. Hmong people were terrified. They were also in a new community without access to some old traditions to protect them. Young men started staying awake, trying to avoid the monster. They downed caffeine. They were actually scared enough that it caused stress to their hearts and they died. Eventually, 117 men died from Hmong sleeping sickness. Oh man, I have one. When I was teen there were rumors of Snowsuit Man. A dude that used to wander the big park in my city at night, in the summer, in a snowsuit all done up from head to toe, hood and everything. It was rumored he used to ask people walking through the park to beat him up. I know, pretty outrageous, right? One night a bunch of us were chilling in said park being teens, smoking weed and goofing around. All of a sudden in the distance we see a person. It wasn't unusual to see other people in the park, even in the middle of the night like this. What is unusual is that you could see the person was dressed in white from head to toe. As he got closer a silence fell over all of us as we realized, holy effing crap, that is a person, in a goddarn snowsuit. We were terrified and amazed all at once. He sat on a bench a little down the path from us. Just sitting there. One of my more adventurous, or stupid maybe, friends went over. Sat on the bench a bit then came back over. Snowsuit Man didn't ask to get his butt kicked like we heard. In fact, he didn't respond or even acknowledge my friend's presence. He did apparently smell absolutely awful. It was obvious, my friend said that he didn't take that thing off. And poo and pee in there, as evidenced by the massive stains he saw when he got closer. So there you go. While not exactly like we heard, unless it wasn't a night he felt like getting beat up, the effing snowsuit man exists. Whispering monkey people. One of the countries in Southeast Asia, can't remember which one, had a myth about monkey people, who would talk in soft voices and kidnap people. In the last decade some archaeologists uncovered an offshoot of proto-humans that coexisted with Homo sapiens in that area for several thousand years. Based on their physiology there was something about their throat or mouth that would have made them only able to whisper. Girls at LSU would wake up thinking they were being watched and snuggled up against while sleeping. Turns out a guy broke in 12+ girls' homes and snuggled them, ate their food etc. and would slip out their windows. He was dubbed the serial snuggler. Oh, I have one. In Anchorage, people will tell the story of a woman who died after getting stuck in only knee-deep mud out in Turnagain Arm. The story has all the elements. She was a newlywed, rescuers were gathered around trying to help her, etc. And I think it's widely regarded as an urban legend. But it most certainly did happen. Her name was Adiana Dickinson, and it took place in September 1988. Anchorage Daily News article. It happened to me a few weeks ago. I was at the beach standing in one place looking at a really old shipwreck. My feet felt weird and when I looked down they were half submerged in mud/sand. It took a surprising amount of effort to pull my legs out considering they were only about an inch in. I can imagine anything below knee would be impossible to get out. It's not mud so much as silt. Silt will F you up. There is a reason it's not recommended to walk on the beaches by the ocean in Alaska, and silt is a big part of that. Think of it like a deep mud that is very strong. You'll get stuck in place, the tide comes in, then you die. I remember being warned about it all the time when I lived up there, even remember hearing about the story OP mentioned. Welcome to the World of AIDS, is an urban legend about a man meeting a woman at a bar, going back to his place to sleep together, only to have him wake up to her being gone and the famous slogan, "Welcome to the World of AIDS," written on his bathroom mirror. The urban legend has many different variations. It was just a parable about casual sex and risk. This was largely considered an urban legend. That is, until stealth pausing actually turned out to be a very real thing. Modern actual cases involve a British man named Daryl Rowe who, already knowing he had HIV, would send a text after sex to his many victims saying things like, "I have HIV LOL. Oops. And I'm riddled." Others have also been convicted for knowingly doing this on Craigslist. Yeah, happened to my friend a few years ago from a Grindr hookup. After the one-night stand, he received a message along the lines of, "Have fun with HIV." He freaked, got tested, and found out he was positive. The human waste that infected him had already deleted all traces of himself on Grindr, so no charges could be pressed. Luckily, he is doing well these days. No full-blown AIDS but deals with occasional bone/hip degeneration issues. In the 1930s kids were talking about seeing an old gray man lurking around and snatching kids. Turned out to be Albert Fish, a murderer, rapist, cannibal, sadist, masochist, etc. The guy who took and ate a young girl then sent a letter to her parents about it. Obviously this is a disturbing read, be warned. The spa in my tiny rural town actually was a covert Asian whorehouse full of human-trafficked women. This was a rumor among everyone at my school. Every bit of it was true. They raided it in 2008, rescued 4 women who spoke no English, and their boss, who was working with the human traffickers and basically acted as prison warden for those poor girls. They were all poor young girls from somewhere in Korea. Not entirely proven true, but still really interesting, is the Westall UFO encounter in 1966. Over 200 people saw a UFO land right in front of them in plain daylight. Almost everyone that witnessed had the same description of the craft. One girl became hysterical at the sight, and later that day one of her best friends went to go see her at her house she had been to many times previous, only to find another family living there entirely and the new mother saying she had never heard of said girl. Military immediately showed up and confiscated all pictures of the event and told students not to talk about it. Easily one of the oddest, terrifying, and just plain confusing events I've ever heard of.